So what we're going to do is we're going to build our baseline virtual machines. What do I mean by that? One of the things I like to do is just create a series of, if you like, empty Windows Server virtual machines that I can then quickly take those and configure them to my particular requirements. Maybe on one I want to install SQL Server, maybe on another I want to install the Business One integration components, maybe on a different one I want to install SharePoint Server, but by creating these empty basic Windows Server virtual machines, it makes that whole process very, very easy. So let's go and let's create an empty virtual Windows Server virtual machine. So you can see I've got a few different virtual servers now running on my Hyper-V platform, and there's some other ones that I've just pulled in, just quickly imported from another virtual server that I have. But we're going to go across here and we're going to click on New, and we're going to create a new virtual machine. So it's going to just run us through basically a wizard that walks you through the step-by-step components of building your virtual machine. Then once you've created your virtual machine, you can copy it, you can store it somewhere else, you can do basically whatever you want with it, because it's fundamentally it's just a series of files. So I'm going to say next, and then it's going to ask me for a name and a location for this virtual machine. So I'm going to say we'll call this Baseline Windows 2008 R2 server, and it's going to ask me where do I want to store the virtual machine, and I've got a couple of different choices there. I can accept the default location that Hyper-V has created for me, or I'm able to go and specify a different location, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to say store the virtual machine in a different location, then I'm going to choose browse. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Hyper-V server machine. Now you can see I've got my 1.8 terabyte storage location here. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to create a new folder on this location, and that's where I'm going to store all of these files. So you can see I've created a folder here called Baseline VMs. So I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to say select folder. So now that's where it's going to store this Baseline Windows 2008 R2 server. So I'll say next, how much memory do I want to allocate to it? Well, to make sure it's running nice and fast during the installation process, I'm just going to allocate 2 gig of RAM to it. So you can go and you can change that anytime you want. You can move that up and down. When you take this virtual machine and create a new virtual machine from this, you can set the memory parameters for each virtual machine completely differently, so don't worry too much about this. Just make sure you've got enough to do the installation up front, and then we'll say next. Now then you want to tell it which virtual network do you want it connected to. Now I've got 2 virtual networks in my server. You can choose whichever one you want depending on how the virtual networking has been set up. I'm going to choose virtual network A. Again, same thing, any of these parameters, once you've created your baseline, you can change that for each different virtual machine, so don't lose too much sleep over that, over the choices that you make here. Now what I want to do, this is where it does start to get important, is I want to create a virtual hard disk. So how much space do I want to allocate for this virtual hard disk? And I usually find, in all honesty, around about 80 gig is enough for pretty much any virtual machine that you're using for demonstration purposes. The default here is 127 gig. I'm going to use the default just for the sake of keeping it easy, but you can play with that, figure out what works best for you. Like I said, about 80 gig is usually enough for a demo environment. You can even go smaller if you want, but in this case I'm going to say 127 gig is fine, and I'm going to let it use this name for the virtual hard disk. So you can create as many virtual hard disks as you want, and you can have multiple virtual hard disks connected to a virtual machine just the same as you can with a physical server. But in this case I'm just going to create one, because don't forget, we're not really worried too much about performance here, because what we're building is a demo environment and a development environment. So unless you're going to start doing some really heavy duty performance testing, you don't need to worry too much about that. So I'll say next. What do I want to do? do I want to install the operating system later, or do I want to install the operating system now from a boot CD or DVD? And that's what I want to do. Now this is where you'll see why it's important that we've downloaded the ISO files, because we can boot directly off an ISO file. So I'll browse out to where I stored those ISO files, and you'll remember I stored them on my C drive in a directory called ISO. So these are the ISO files that I've got. So here it is. Here's the one that I want. It's my Windows Server 2008 R2 ISO. So I simply select that. I say open, and then I'll say next, and that's basically it. So as soon as I click finish, it's going to create the virtual machine. It's going to trigger the installation process of the operating system. So I'll say finish. You can see it's creating my virtual machine for me now. And there it is. I now have my baseline Windows 2008 R2 server. So that's all I need to do. I can now go and I can start installing the operating system. So let's make that our next step. So to install the operating system, all I need to do is to go here and choose Connect, because what I want to do is have my virtual machine available to me through the console. You can see it's saying the virtual machine baseline Windows 2008 R2 server is turned off. So then I just go up here and I choose Start, and you'll see just the same as a normal Windows machine, I get my my startup process, and it's booting up from that ISO. Now that that's just resized, I'll just pull that back down here, and now I go and I specify, well, exactly how do I want this server configured? Well, I want it in English, and because I'm in Australia, I want to have English Australia. Now, of course, the beauty of this is you can create as many different virtual machines with different language and different localization settings, and then just pull them in and out as you need to in order to do your testing. So I'll say next, and then all I do is just choose Install Now. My setup routine is starting. Now, you don't need to have your Windows installation keys right now to make this work. I would recommend that you do, but again, if you've taken my advice and you've signed up for the Microsoft Action Pack subscription, you'll have the necessary server keys that you need to build these. So I'm going to do a Windows Server 2008 R2 standard full installation, and I'll say next. I'll accept the license terms and I'll say next. I'll choose custom because I want to create a new machine. I want to choose my virtual hard disk that's been created. There it is. You can see it's unallocated 127 gig. I'll just say next, and then we'll let Windows go ahead and do what it needs to do to start the installation. I'm just going to pause for a while until we get to the next step in the process. So now you can see the first part of the Windows installation has finished. So the virtual machine reboots itself as normally happens when you're doing a Windows installation. And then we move on to the next part of the Windows install. Once all the files have been copied, we're now going to configure our virtual server. So now the installation is completing and it's going to move on. We've got one more restart that's going to occur now. You can see this whole process is fairly quick. So if you've got a machine that's up to spec, if you followed my recommended specification, your installations, your process should be just as quick as what I'm going through here. I get my message that the user's password must be changed before logging on for the first time, so I'm just going to put in my standard password that I always use, and I would recommend you do a similar thing, and of course always document your passwords so you can always quickly work with these virtual machines. So my password's now been changed, and you can now see my Windows Server machine is basically ready to roll for me to do the next steps. So what I've done, just to make it a little bit easier to see, is I've resized my virtual server down to 800 by 600, which is perfectly okay for what we're going to be doing here. So you can see Windows Server 2008 R2. When you first configure the machine, it gives you a whole bunch of tasks that you need to do. You can activate Windows, set your time zone, configure your networking, provide a computer name and domain, all of these different things, download and install your updates and so on. So the main thing I want to do right now is I'm not going to do any of those other steps. The one thing I want to do right now is I want to go here into Action, and I want to install my integration services. So I'll say Insert Integration Services, Setup Disk. What that does is that then sets up a virtual DVD that allows me to install the integration services, which are a series of services which control the integration between the virtual machine host and the virtual machine guest. So it's very important that you install these. So I'll choose Install. Now it's telling me that the Hyper-V integration services are already installed on this version of Windows, which is fine because it's done the necessary installation for me already as part of the virtual machine creation. Now the next thing I want to do, just before I park this baseline machine and consider it ready for use in a productive way, is I want to go and I want to apply all the necessary updates that are available right now, just to make sure that every time I create a new virtual server, I don't have to spend time waiting for all of those updates to be applied. Now on my network, I'm running Windows Server Update Services, so all I need to do is go in and configure this machine to point to my Windows Server Update Services machine. Now if I joined it to the domain, that would happen automatically, but I don't want to join this baseline machine to a domain. I don't want to set a machine name. I don't want to do anything like that. All I want to do is just make sure that all those updates are done. So I'm going to go in and configure it to point to that particular machine. So I've gone and done that, and now it's downloading all of the latest updates and patches that I needed, and I'm going to let that run through, let those apply, and then my virtual machine is going to be ready for me to use. And as you can see, I now have my baseline Windows 2008 R2 server sitting here. Next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go through the process of duplicating that, and then we're going to install SAP Business One, SQL Server, and the necessary components just to get our basic SAP Business One system up and running.